The old man's walker hit the diner floor with a sound like a gunshot. Nobody moved. 78 years old, a Vietnam combat veteran, and two uniformed officers were laughing at him. Laughing. While morning coffee got cold in 20 cups and 20 pairs of eyes, found something very interesting to study on the tabletop. Nobody moved, except a German shepherd at the back of the diner who was already on his feet, and the quiet man holding his leash, a man the officers hadn't bothered to look at yet, who set down his mug with the particular stillness of someone deciding something irreversible. They should have looked. If this kind of story moves you, subscribe, hit the like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The storm had been building since before dawn. Ethan Mercer noticed it the way he noticed most things. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one filed and cataloged before the next arrived. The pressure drop in his sinuses when he woke at 04:30. The way Atlas had paced the kitchen instead of settling beside his bowl. The particular color of the sky over Greyhaven Point, a bruised greenish gray that the locals called a nor'easter throat clear, meaning the real punch was still loading up somewhere offshore, waiting. He'd lived on this coast long enough to respect that kind of patience. The house was cold. It was always cold now since he'd started rationing the heating oil. The furnace worked fine. His father had maintained it with the same obsessive care the man applied to everything mechanical. But oil cost money, and money had been the central, grinding, inescapable problem for the better part of 8 months. Ethan pulled on a flannel over his thermal, laced his boots at the kitchen table, and watched Atlas finish his breakfast with the focused efficiency of a dog who'd eaten out of a pouch in the back of a vehicle more times than he'd eaten from a ceramic bowl. "Slow down," Ethan told him. Atlas looked up briefly, then returned to the bowl at exactly the same pace. Ethan drank his coffee black and standing, the way he'd drunk it for 20 years. On the counter beside the coffee maker sat a manila envelope he'd already opened 3 times in the past 2 weeks, as though the contents might have changed. They hadn't. Foreclosure notice. Greyhaven County Savings and Loan. The language was polite. The deadline was not. 60 days had become 40. 40 had become 19. 19 days to produce $11,000 in back payments or the house passed to the bank, and the bank had already been in preliminary discussions. He'd found this out through his neighbor Frank Osgood, who worked part-time as a county records clerk with a development company called Ardmore Group LLC about the entire North End residential corridor. Frank had used the phrase preliminary discussions with the particular careful blankness of a man who knew more than he was saying. Ethan hadn't pushed. He had enough problems already assembled. The house itself was the problem, and the reason simultaneously. His parents had bought it in 1987, a salt box colonial 3 blocks from the water, the kind of house that was worth a modest sum for 30 years, and then, sometime around 2019, became worth an immodest sum as wealthy people discovered Greyhaven Point and began converting it from a working fishing community into something that appeared on weekend travel blogs. His parents had died within 14 months of each other. His mother from pancreatic cancer, his father from what the doctors called cardiac arrest, and Ethan privately understood to be grief, and left the house jointly to him and his younger sister Claire. Claire was a nurse at Greyhaven Memorial. She worked 3 12s a week and raised her son Marcus on the remaining 4 days without complaint and without, as far as Ethan could tell, any particular bitterness about the situation, which he found more admirable than he usually remembered to say out loud. Marcus was 9. He had their father's jaw and their mother's stubbornness and an ongoing, serious relationship with a particular worn-out Yankees cap that he wore in all weather. Claire couldn't cover the back payments. Ethan's income from the marine repair yard, 12-hour days in a corrugated metal building that smelled of diesel and salt, covered current expenses and approximately nothing else. He'd applied for a veteran's assistance loan in March. It was still pending. The woman at the assistance office had said, "These things take time," in a way that meant she didn't expect it to clear. So the envelope sat on the counter, and Ethan looked at it each morning the way you look at a problem you're not ready to solve, and then he clicked the leash on Atlas and went out into the pre-storm dark. They walked the long route. Ethan always walked the long route when he had too much running through his head. 3 miles along the harbor road, past the boatyards and the fish processing plant, and the shuttered bait shop that used to belong to a man named Cordell, who had the best laugh in 3 counties and died of liver failure in 2021. The harbor smelled of brine and diesel and something faintly rotten that was just the ocean doing what oceans do. Atlas moved at his left side without being asked, pace-matched, nose working the air in slow sweeps. The dog was 11. For a German shepherd, particularly one who had spent 6 of those years working with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, in conditions that ground most animals down to nothing, 11 was a significant number. His muzzle had gone mostly gray. He had a long surgical scar along his left hindquarter from an IED incident outside Sangin in 2016 that had ended both their deployments simultaneously. He moved well, better than anyone had a right to expect, but Ethan watched for the slight stiffening in cold mornings and adjusted the walks accordingly. The VA had tried to send Atlas to an adoption program when Ethan separated. Ethan had filled out 17 forms over 6 weeks and driven to 3 different facilities and sat in 4 waiting rooms to prevent that from happening. He did not consider this exceptional effort. He considered it the minimum required. "You smell that?" he said quietly. Atlas had already stopped, one forepaw slightly raised, nose tilted into the wind coming off the water. "Yeah," Ethan said. "It's coming." He didn't mean just the storm. The Anchor Diner sat at the corner of Clement and Harbor View, a low building with salt-fogged windows and a hand-lettered sign advertising the Tuesday special that hadn't been updated since sometime in the previous decade. It opened at 6. Ethan arrived at 6:18 and took the booth at the back, the one with a sight line to the door, and both the counter and the emergency exit, because some habits are not habits so much as permanent rewiring. Atlas settled under the table. His chin found Ethan's boot. Margie, who had worked the morning shift at the Anchor for as long as Ethan could remember, brought coffee without being asked and set down a laminated menu she knew he wouldn't open. "Looks bad out there," she said. "Getting there." "You eating or just drinking?" "Eating. 2 eggs, wheat toast, no butter." She wrote nothing down the way she never wrote anything down, and moved back toward the counter with the particular efficiency of someone who has performed the same sequence of motions 10,000 times and streamlined out all unnecessary movement. The diner was about 2/3 full. Fishermen mostly, a few workers from the processing plant, a pair of contractors in Carhartt who were arguing in low voices about rebar specifications. The television bolted to the wall near the coffee maker was running a weather segment, the meteorologist gesturing at rotating patterns offshore with the restrained excitement of someone who understood what they were looking at. Ethan watched the door. He didn't know why exactly. He was not an anxious person. Anxiety implies uncertainty about outcome, and Ethan had made a long peace with the fact that outcomes were largely beyond his control. It was more a form of maintenance, the same way you keep a vehicle's engine warm in cold weather, not because you expect to need it, but because you understand the cost of needing it cold. The door opened at 6:41, and Victor Hale came in out of the wind. Ethan noted him in the way he noted everything, quickly, without emphasis. An elderly man, late 70s probably, slight build, wearing a rain jacket over a flannel shirt and carrying the weight of the morning poorly. The walker was aluminum, the kind with tennis ball feet, and he managed it with the particular arm-shoulder coordination of someone who'd been using one long enough to develop a technique. He moved to a counter stool with slow deliberation and settled onto it with the faint exhale of someone for whom sitting down has become a mild achievement. Margie brought him coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug. Outside, the wind picked up. Oh. The 2 officers came in at 6:53. Ethan didn't recognize them immediately. Greyhaven Point had a 14-man department, and he knew a few of them well enough to nod to, but these 2 were not the ones he nodded to. They were young, mid-20s probably, the kind of young that hasn't yet learned the difference between confidence and performance. One was tall, with close-cropped hair, and a jaw that suggested he'd been told it was impressive. The other was heavier, thicker through the chest, and carried himself with the slight forward lean of someone perpetually awaiting an opportunity to assert authority. They took the counter stools 2 down from the old man without acknowledging him. For a few minutes, everything was ordinary. Then the tall one said something to the heavy one, and they both laughed, and the heavy one's elbow moved in a gesture toward the old man that was not quite pointing, but wasn't not pointing either, the kind of gesture you make when you want to establish a shared joke without technically committing to it. The old man didn't react. He was looking at his coffee. Margie brought Ethan's eggs. "Everything okay?" she said quietly. He looked at her. She had a certain tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd taken his order. "Fine," he said. She moved away. She moved away faster than usual. It started small, the way these things always start. The tall officer said something to the old man. Ethan couldn't hear the words, only the tone, which was the tone of a question that isn't actually a question. The old man responded with a few words. The officer said something else, and the heavy one laughed again. And then the tall one reached over and lifted the old man's coffee mug from the counter and moved it 6 inches to the left, past the far edge of the old man's natural reach. Just 6 inches. It was the most precise form of contempt Ethan had ever witnessed. The kind that doesn't touch anything it can be called on, that lives entirely in the plausible deniability between deliberate and accidental. The old man looked at the mug. He didn't say anything. He shifted on his stool to reach for it, and his balance went, and he grabbed for the edge of the counter, and the grab knocked his walker, and the walker went down. The sound it made when it hit the tile was exactly what Ethan had thought earlier, like a gunshot in a closed space. Everyone in the diner went still. The two officers looked at the walker on the floor. The tall one said something that Ethan caught this time. "Little clumsy this morning, Pops." Neither of them moved to pick it up. Nobody moved, except Atlas. The dog was on his feet before Ethan's hands had left the edge of the table. Not lunging, not aggressive, just up, oriented, the particular posture of a working dog who has identified a situation requiring acknowledgement. His ears were forward and his tail was still, and he was looking at the two officers with the complete focused attention that well-trained dogs reserve for things they have assessed as requiring watching. Ethan was already out of the booth. He moved through the diner the way he moved through most spaces, without speed, without announcement, taking the most direct line. He picked up the walker. He set it upright beside the old man's stool. He did this before either officer had processed that he was moving, which meant that by the time the tall one turned to look at him, Ethan was already straightening up and they were standing approximately 3 feet apart. He was aware of several things simultaneously. The height differential. The officer had 2 inches on him. The counter at his back. No, the officer's back, which meant Ethan had better lateral options. The other diners, who had achieved a collective held breath. Margie, behind the counter, who had her hand near the phone. Atlas, who had moved silently to a position that was between the old man and the officers and was not growling, not showing teeth, simply standing there like a fact. "You dropped something," Ethan said. It was not the most eloquent statement he'd ever made. He was aware of this. The tall officer looked at him for a moment with the expression of a person recalculating. "You talking to me?" "The walker. You knocked it." "I didn't knock anything." "The mug," Ethan said. "You moved it past his reach. He grabbed for it. Walker went down." "That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened." Ethan's voice was level. It wasn't a voice he performed. It was what his voice did when he was very calm, which was different from being relaxed. "And right now there are 20 people in this room who saw the same thing." A silence. The heavy officer moved slightly, adjusting his weight forward, a territorial shift. Ethan noted it. "You're going to want to step back," the tall officer said. "I'm having breakfast," Ethan said. "I'll step back when I'm finished with this." "Finished with what?" "Making sure this man has his walker." Another silence, longer this time. The tall officer looked at Ethan the way people look at problems they weren't expecting and haven't yet categorized. Then he looked at Atlas, who had not moved, and something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not retreat, more like recalibration. "Mind your business," he said. "This is my business," Ethan said. "This diner is my business. That man is my business. Everything happening inside this building while I'm in it is my business." A pause. "That's just how I'm put together." The old man on the stool had straightened slightly. He was watching Ethan with an expression that was hard to read. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more complicated. Something that looked like recognition. The heavy officer said, "You got a problem with law enforcement?" "I've got a problem with what I'm watching." "Which is?" "2 grown men in uniform deciding an old man's morning was a good target." Ethan let that sit for a second. "There's no version of that I'm going to find acceptable." The tall officer's jaw tightened. "You know who I am?" "No." "Officer Dale Crusoe. And you're about 30 seconds from making a very stupid choice." Ethan looked at him steadily. I've made a few of those. Never regretted the ones that came from looking someone in the eye. Crusoe took a breath, seemed to be working through something internally, and then he looked around the diner, at the 20 still faces, at Atlas standing immovable between him and the old man, at Margie with her hand on the phone. And his read of the room was accurate enough that he made the choice professionals make when they determine that the tactical situation has shifted against them. He stepped back. Not far. Not with any acknowledgement. He turned back to the counter and picked up his coffee cup and said something quietly to the heavy officer, and they both acted for the next several minutes as if Ethan did not exist, which was a choice that also told a story. Ethan returned to his booth. Atlas came with him. Before the dog settled back under the table, he turned once toward the old man at the counter, a brief, deliberate look that Ethan couldn't assign any specific meaning to, but found he couldn't dismiss either. Good boy, Ethan said quietly. Atlas's tail moved once. He put his chin on Ethan's boot. What? The officers left before 7. Neither looked back. The diner exhaled. Margie appeared at Ethan's booth with a coffee refill he hadn't asked for. She poured it without comment. She put her hand briefly on the back of his booth, not touching him, just resting it there for a moment, and then she moved away. From across the room, the old man was looking at him. Ethan nodded once. The old man held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded back, and his eyes held something that Ethan read as more than acknowledgement. Something older and more particular, the look of a man who has spent a long time searching for something and has unexpectedly found himself much closer to it than he expected. Ethan didn't know what to do with that, so he ate his eggs. His name, Ethan found out later through Frank Osgood, was Victor Hale. 78 years old. A Vietnam veteran. Army. 2 tours. A decoration or two that Frank mentioned but couldn't remember the names of. He'd been living in a rented room at the Bayview Motor Lodge on the south end of town for approximately 3 weeks, which was odd because the Bayview was the kind of place you stayed when you were in transit, not the kind of place you settled into. He had no apparent family in the area. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a veteran's plate and a parking permit from a county Frank recognized as being about 4 hours inland. What he was doing in Greyhaven Point, Frank didn't know, or claimed not to know, with that same careful blankness. Ethan filed this the way he filed most things, and went back to his work. The marine repair yard was owned by a man named Pete Slocum, 62, who had hired Ethan 3 years ago with fewer questions than most employers asked, and paid him slightly better than the work required, which Ethan understood to be a form of kindness that Pete preferred not to name. The yard handled everything from fiberglass patching on recreational boats to diesel engine overhauls on the commercial fishing fleet, and the work had a rhythm Ethan found tolerable in the specific way that work with clear mechanical logic was always tolerable. The problem was visible, the solution had defined steps, and when you were done, the thing either worked or it didn't. He spent the morning on a lobster boat engine that had developed an injector problem, his hands in the cold, greasy dark of the engine compartment, Atlas sleeping on a folded tarp a few feet away. The rain started properly around 9, drumming on the corrugated roof with an irregular percussion that was half pleasant and half something else, the kind of sound that makes you aware of everything you're trying not to think about. Around 11, Pete appeared at the bay door. "You hear about that thing at the Anchor this morning?" Ethan looked up. "I was there." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Figured." He leaned in the doorway, watching the rain. "Crusoe's got a mouth and a memory." "I know." "His uncle's on the planning commission." Ethan considered this. "Okay." "Just telling you," Pete said, "not telling you what to do with it." "I know." Pete disappeared back into the rain. Ethan went back to the injector. But his hands had slowed slightly, performing the motions from muscle memory while his mind ran the kind of rapid automatic assessment he'd been trained to run and couldn't seem to stop running even now, years out. Crusoe. Planning Commission uncle. Foreclosure in 19 days. Victor Hale at the Bayview Motor Lodge with an inland county permit and 3 weeks of unclear purpose. He tightened a fuel line fitting and thought, these pieces don't go together yet. The rain picked up. Well, he got home at 5:30 to find Claire's car in the driveway, and Marcus at the kitchen table doing something with a protractor that appeared to be producing more anxiety than geometry. "Uncle Ethan," Marcus said, with the particular emphasis of a 9-year-old who is deploying a greeting as an interrogation opening. Can a protractor be broken if it's never dropped? Depends. What's wrong with it? It won't do what I want. Protractors don't do things. You do things with them. A pause. Marcus looked at the protractor. Okay, but what if I'm doing the wrong thing? Show me. Claire was at the stove, stirring something that smelled of tomato and garlic, and the particular efficiency of a person who cooks well while actively refusing to think about cooking. She looked at Ethan in the brief, assessing way that sisters look at brothers they're worried about. You're on the news, she said. He stopped. Not by name, she added, but Greyhaven's kind of small. What news? Someone had a phone out at the anchor this morning, posted it this afternoon. It's been shared about, she checked her phone briefly, 400 times in the past 3 hours, which for Greyhaven is basically going viral. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table beside Marcus and stared at the protractor without seeing it. What do I look like? He asked. You look like you. How does that read? Claire set down the spoon and turned to look at him directly. She was 38 and had their mother's eyes and the kind of steadiness that comes from working emergency nursing for 12 years and raising a kid alone. Honestly, you look like you know something the other people in the room don't. She paused. Which I guess you did. The dog looks good, Marcus offered, without looking up from the protractor problem. He looks like he's protecting someone. He was, Ethan said. Atlas, who had been performing his after-walk settling routine by the mat near the door, raised his head briefly at the sound of his own unspoken name. Ethan hadn't said it, but the dog had heard something, and then set it down again. Dinner was quiet in the good way. Marcus explained his protractor situation in considerable detail and eventually arrived at the understanding that the protractor was fine and he had been holding it wrong, which he received with the philosophical acceptance of a kid who has been told this particular truth before. Claire talked about her shift without talking about the hardest parts of it, which was another thing she was good at. Ethan ate and listened and tried not to think about Dale Crusoe and his uncle on the planning commission. He mostly succeeded. At 9:15, after Marcus was in bed and Claire was doing her charts on the couch, Ethan sat on the back porch with Atlas and watched the storm work through its middle movement, the sustained, businesslike rain that followed the initial drama and settled into something patient and gray and endless feeling. He was thinking about the old man's face, not the expression of gratitude or relief you'd expect. The other thing, that specific look. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, local area code. He considered it for a moment. Yeah, he answered. A pause. Then a voice, older, careful, with the particular diction of a man who chooses words because he understands they have weight. Mr. Mercer, my name is Victor Hale. I apologize for calling this late. Another pause. You don't know me. I know who you are, Ethan said. A longer pause. Then you know more than I expected. The voice was quiet but not weak. I'd like to speak with you. Not on the phone. Tomorrow, if you're willing. Ethan looked out at the rain. Thought about Pete's warning, about Crusoe's uncle, about the foreclosure envelope on the counter, and the 19 days and the way the pieces weren't fitting together yet. Where, he said. The park on Clement, by the harbor. 8 o'clock. I'll be there. The call ended. Atlas was watching him with the forward-tilted attention he reserved for moments he'd determined were significant. I know, Ethan said. The dog set his chin on Ethan's knee, and outside the storm pushed against the coast with the patience of something that has been building for a long time and is only now beginning to show what it is. At 10:40 p.m., headlights crossed the wall of Ethan's bedroom. A car, moving slowly down his street, pausing briefly in front of the house. Not parking. Not turning around, just pausing, the way a car pauses when someone in it wants to know if a light is on. The light in Ethan's bedroom was on. He lay still and listened to the car continue down the street and turn at the corner. He noted the time. He noted the direction of travel. He thought about 19 days and Dale Crusoe and a 78-year-old man with an inland county parking permit who had specifically come to find him. He did not sleep for a long time. And in the morning, when he checked the front step before his walk, he found a notice tucked under the door. Not an official notice, just a folded sheet of paper. On it, printed in block letters. You should have stayed in your booth. Ethan read it once, folded it back along the crease, placed it on the counter next to the foreclosure envelope. Then he clicked the leash on Atlas, and they went out into the gray morning, and behind them the door closed on a house that felt, for the first time, like a position. The park on Clement was empty at 8, except for the gulls. They stood along the top of the seawall like sentries, hunched into the wind off the harbor, indifferent to the cold and to Ethan, and to the old man who arrived 4 minutes after Ethan did, moving his walker across the wet pavement with the careful economy of someone who has learned not to rush anything that can't afford a fall. Ethan had been there since 7:50. He'd taken the bench with his back to the wall and a sight line in both directions along the path, which was habit, and he'd spent the 10 minutes watching a lobster boat work out of the harbor mouth into the chop, which was something closer to need. There was something about watching men go out to work in weather that settled him. It had no meaning he could articulate. It just did. Victor Hale stopped at the bench and looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back. He won't bite, Ethan said. I know. Victor lowered himself onto the far end of the bench with the deliberate joint-by-joint sequence of a man who has cataloged exactly which movements cost what. He set the walker in front of him and wrapped both hands around its crossbar and looked out at the harbor for a long moment before he said anything. I had a dog, German Shepherd, a long time ago, different context. Military? A slight nod. Long time ago, he said again in a tone that closed that particular door. Ethan waited. Victor was a man who had clearly spent decades learning how to read silences and respond to them accordingly, so the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was more like a mutual acknowledgement that they were both people who understood the value of not filling space with noise. Eventually, Victor reached into the inside pocket of his rain jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper, creased down the middle, and held it out. Ethan took it, unfolded it. It was a property map of Greyhaven Point's North Residential Corridor. 7 blocks, maybe 40 properties, each one marked with a handwritten notation, dates, amounts, a single letter code he didn't immediately recognize. F is foreclosure, Victor said. E is code violation, fabricated, in every case I've confirmed. C is a condemned notice that was reversed on appeal, but only after the family had already left. He paused. R is what I call a resolve, meaning the family signed over the property before I could document the pressure that made them do it. Ethan looked at the map, counted the marks. 26 properties, 14 blocks covered in 18 months. Ardmore Group, he said. Victor looked at him. You know the name? I know my house is on their list. A pause. Something moved through the old man's expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. Yes, it is. He reached into the jacket again and produced a second sheet, a printed page, a photograph, a man in his 50s with the kind of face that belongs on a hospital donor wall, silver-haired and broadly smiling. Randall Voss, CEO of Ardmore. He lives in Boston. He has never set foot in Greyhaven Point in his life, as far as I can determine. Victor's voice was level, informational, the voice of a man delivering a briefing. He doesn't need to. He has people here. The officers. Some of them, not all. The Planning Commission is the primary mechanism. Violations get filed. Hearings get scheduled. Appeals get quietly buried. The police provide the pressure that makes people stop fighting before the appeals happen. Victor folded his hands over the crossbar of the walker. It's a very clean system. It's been running for almost 2 years, and it has not attracted significant attention because the people it targets are elderly, disabled, economically isolated, and individually without the resources to sustain a fight. Ethan refolded the map along its crease and held it for a moment without speaking. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because yesterday morning you made a choice that most people in that room had already decided not to make, Victor said, and because your dog didn't wait to be told. Ethan looked at Atlas, who had settled with his chin on his forepaws and was tracking a gull along the seawall with the mild professional interest of an animal that no longer needs to chase things to feel satisfied about them. That doesn't make me qualified for whatever you're building, Ethan said. I'm not building anything. I'm investigating. There's a difference. Victor's eyes were steady, pale gray, the color of the water below them. I've been at this for 7 months alone. I'm 78 years old. I have documentation of the pattern, but I do not have the kind of evidence that survives a legal challenge. And I have approximately zero ability to walk through this town and knock on doors without making people more frightened than they already are. You think I can do that? I think people who have been afraid for a long time respond differently to someone who is clearly not afraid. A pause. And I think you need a reason to stay in this fight before they find a way to make the cost too high. Ethan was quiet. The lobster boat had disappeared past the breakwater. Another was coming in, riding the swell. "The note on my door last night," Ethan said. Victor nodded slowly. "That was faster than I expected." "How fast did you expect?" "A week. Maybe 2. You seem to be reassessing something. They know who you are. They've known since the video posted. The question is what they think you know, and right now they probably think you're a man who had a bad morning and got lucky with the optics." He paused. "We should not let them upgrade that assessment before we're ready." Ethan looked out at the water for a long time. The cold was real. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and the wind was the kind that finds the gap between collar and neck and stays there. Atlas had tucked his nose under his own forepaw for warmth. "I need a few days," Ethan said. "You have them." Victor reached for his walker and began the process of standing, a process Ethan recognized now as something Victor had optimized through pure repetition. The specific sequence of angles and weight shifts that minimize strain and maximize the probability of success. He got up on the second attempt, reset his balance, and looked at Ethan with that same expression from the diner counter, that look of complicated recognition. "Mr. Mercer, the note they left you, keep it." "Already filed it." Something shifted in Victor's expression, a reassessment, a door reopening very slightly. "I'll be in touch," he said, and moved back across the wet pavement toward the parking area, his walker marking a steady rhythm against the concrete while the gulls watched from the wall and the harbor did what harbors do in November, which is demonstrate indifference to everything human. The first consequence arrived on Wednesday. Pete Slocum called Ethan into the small office at the back of the yard, a room mostly occupied by a desk and a marine radio and a coffee maker of indeterminate age, and shut the door, which Pete almost never did. "I'm not firing you," Pete said immediately, which was a sentence that announced its own context. "Okay. But someone called the yard." He sat behind the desk and put both hands flat on the surface, the posture of a man who is uncomfortable with what he's about to say and has decided to get through it quickly. "Harbor Master's office. Mentioned that there'd been an incident involving one of my employees and suggested, that word specifically, suggested, that I might want to review my staffing situation given the yard's licensing dependencies." Ethan sat in the client chair across the desk. It was a chair designed for people who needed fiberglass repairs quoted, not for conversations like this one, and it was slightly too short. "The licensing dependencies," he said. "The yard's operating license comes up for review every 18 months. We're 4 months out from the next review." Pete met his eyes. "I'm telling you this so you understand the architecture. I'm not telling you to change anything you're doing. You can't afford to have a problem with the review." "I cannot afford to have a problem with the review." Pete picked up a pen and set it down. "The boat's ready, by the way. Injectors are clean. Runs fine. I'll test it tomorrow." "Good." A pause. "How are you doing, Ethan?" It wasn't really a question, the way Pete asked it. It was an acknowledgement that the question existed. "I'm fine," Ethan said. Pete nodded in the way of a man who knows the answer is incomplete and respects that it is. The second consequence was subtler and hit harder. The Veterans Assistance Office called Thursday afternoon to inform him that his loan application had been flagged for additional review and that processing would be delayed a further 60 to 90 days. The woman who called read this from a script and could not tell him who had initiated the flag or on what grounds. And when he asked to speak with the reviewing officer, he was told that the reviewing officer was unavailable and that he would receive written notice within 10 business days. He was standing in the parking lot of the marine yard when he got the call, the phone to his ear, and when it ended, he stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Watching a gull work the updraft off the building's roofline with the mechanical precision of a thing that has no choice about what it does. 19 days had become 15. He called Claire. How bad? She said, instead of hello. They flagged the loan, 60 to 90-day delay. A silence. He could hear the background noise of the hospital corridor, PA system, a door, someone's shoes on linoleum. Okay, she said. Okay, I have some money set aside. Claire, not enough, she said. But some. I've been thinking about this. Another pause. Mom and Dad didn't build that house so it could become a condo for someone who's never set foot in this town. I know. So we fight. He looked at the goal on the updraft. Yeah, he said. We fight. Victor arrived at Ethan's house on Friday evening with a cardboard file box and no advance notice, which Ethan found he didn't mind. Some people you can read well enough within the first 40 minutes to know that their surprises won't be the wrong kind. Marcus opened the door, regarded the old man with the frank assessment of a 9-year-old, and said, "Is that your walker, or do you share it?" "It's mine," Victor said. "Does it have a name?" "It does not." "You should name it," Marcus said seriously, and then retreated toward the kitchen, his function as impromptu doorman apparently complete. Claire gave Victor coffee and a look that said she was reserving judgment, which Ethan recognized as the most Victor was going to get from her on a first meeting and which Victor seemed to understand. He set the file box on the kitchen table and opened it without preamble, and they spent 2 hours going through what he had. It was, Ethan had to admit, substantial. 7 months of careful, methodical documentation, copies of violation notices cross-referenced with county records, a timeline of property transfers, photographs of homes before and after, statements from residents who had agreed to speak but not to sign anything yet. 3 former Planning Commission staff members had spoken to Victor off the record, none willing to go further. There was a pattern of timing. Violations appeared within 2 to 4 weeks of an Ardmore Group property scout making inquiries about a given address, which was either a remarkable coincidence or it wasn't. The problem, Victor said, is that pattern evidence isn't case-closing evidence. Everything here is circumstantial in isolation. What I need are first-hand accounts from people who are willing to name what was said to them directly. The threats. The specific language. He set his coffee down. And I need the video from the diner. There's a video, Ethan said. A young woman. A waitress. I've spoken with her briefly. Emma Brooks? She works the lunch shift Tuesdays through Saturdays. She had her phone recording during the incident. She's frightened. Victor's voice was careful, not dismissive. Understandably. What's she frightened of? Losing her job. Her mother lives in one of the flagged properties on the north end. He looked at Ethan directly. They have good mechanisms for finding leverage. Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking about the architecture Pete had described, the licensing dependencies, the suggestion, the systemic interlocking way that pressure could be applied without leaving marks. I can talk to her, he said. That would be useful. Victor closed the file box. And I'd like you to come with me tomorrow, if you're willing. There are 3 families on the list. They've agreed to speak with someone, but I am, as has been pointed out to me by more than one of them, a very old man who shows up alone and asks frightening questions. You want me for reassurance. I want you because you are credible in a way I am currently not. A pause. And because Atlas is better at this than either of us. Ethan looked at the dog, who was sitting beside Victor's chair with the quiet, steady presence he adopted around people who were carrying something heavy. He wasn't touching the old man. He was just there, in the particular way that well-trained dogs are there, available, undemanding, steady as a wall. Yeah, Ethan said. He is. They started the next morning in the rain, which in Greyhaven Point in November was the only available starting condition. The first house was on Aldrich Street, 3 blocks from the waterfront, a Cape Cod style with a new roof that the owner had put on himself 2 years ago, which was notable because the county had issued a violation notice last April claiming the roof was structurally deficient and required immediate professional remediation at an estimated cost of $9,000. The owner was a man named Roy Pfeiffer, 69 years old, a former merchant marine with a bad knee and hands like sledgehammer heads, who had spent 35 years at sea and come home to Greyhaven Point because it was the only place he'd ever thought of as home. He opened the door and looked at them for a moment. Victor with his walker, Ethan in his work jacket, Atlas at the leash, and then he looked specifically at Atlas for several seconds in a way that seemed to be a form of evaluation. Dog's clean, Pfeiffer said. Come in. The inside of the house was orderly in the way that ships are orderly. Everything secured, nothing out of place, a purposeful arrangement of limited space. He made coffee without asking if they wanted it, and set it on the table and sat across from them with both hands around his mug and the particular stillness of a man who has survived enough to stop performing composure. The roof is fine, he said, before either of them spoke. I've had 2 independent contractors look at it. Both said it's solid. I have the reports. We believe you, Victor said. Then what do you want from me? What happened after you got the notice? Pfeiffer was quiet for a moment, working something through internally. Then he said, Officer came by. Not in uniform. Personal vehicle. Said he'd heard about my situation, said it was a shame, said sometimes these things could be resolved without going through the whole appeal process if a man was willing to be practical. He set his mug down. I asked him what practical meant. He said there was a company interested in the property, that they were offering fair market on a short timeline, and that if I was cooperative about the timeline, the violation might get resolved on the other end. Might, Victor said. That was his word. Might. Pfeiffer's jaw tightened slightly. I told him to get out of my house. He left. 2 weeks later, I got a notice about the electrical panel. Ethan looked up from the table. What was wrong with the panel? Nothing was wrong with the panel. I called an electrician out of my own pocket. She spent 40 minutes in the basement and told me the panel was fine and asked me what genius had flagged it. He looked between them. So now I have 2 violations pending, both fabricated, both requiring professional remediation I can't afford, and a hearing date that keeps getting pushed back, which means the violations stay active on the record and nobody will give me a loan against the property in the meantime. The hearing pushes, Victor said. Do they give reasons? Scheduling conflicts. Pfeiffer's voice was flat. Every single time. Scheduling conflicts. They stayed for 40 minutes. Before they left, Atlas had moved quietly from beside Ethan's chair to beside Pfeiffer's and was sitting there in his steady, available way. And Pfeiffer had one hand resting on the dog's back with the absence of self-consciousness that people display when they've forgotten they're being observed. He was working military, Pfeiffer said. It wasn't really a question. 6 years, Ethan said. Pfeiffer nodded. His hand moved once along the dog's spine, slow and deliberate. Good dog, he said quietly, to no one in particular. Bob. The second house was on Maple Cross, and the story was different in its details and identical in its architecture. A widow named Dorothea Crane, 74, whose late husband had been a Navy corpsman. 3 code violations in 8 months. Her daughter had driven up from Portland to help her fight the first appeal and had been contacted at her workplace. Not threatened, not technically, just contacted, just a phone call expressing concern about the situation, just someone making sure she knew her mother's name was in the county system. The daughter had not come back. Dorothea served them tea in cups that didn't match and told the story in the even, slightly distant voice of a person who has processed a bad thing enough times that the processing has become its own kind of armor. But when Victor spread the property map on her kitchen table and she saw her house marked on it among 26 others, something shifted in her face. Not just anger, though there was anger, something more like relief. The specific relief of learning you are not crazy, that what happened to you was real and documented and not the product of bad luck. There are others, she said. Yes, Victor said. She looked at the map for a long time. Atlas had settled near the door. I wasn't approaching her. He'd read the room differently than he'd read Pfeiffer, and he was giving her space rather than presence, which Ethan noticed without being able to fully explain how the dog had made that distinction. Some calibration built into him that went beyond training into something closer to understanding. What do you need from me? Dorothea said. Your story, Victor said. In writing, when you're ready. Nothing more than that right now. She folded her hands in her lap. And what does writing it down actually do? The question was direct and fair and deserved a direct answer. Victor gave her one. By itself, nothing. As part of a pattern with 26 others, it's the kind of evidence that can survive a legal challenge. He paused. I'm not going to tell you this is safe. I'm going to tell you that staying silent has a cost too, and that the cost of staying silent is already being paid. Another long silence. All right, she said, when I'm ready. The third visit did not go as well. The man on Morrison Street met. A veteran named Carl Buell, 56, 2 tours Army in the Gulf, opened the door and looked at them and said no before Victor had finished his first sentence. He said it without anger and without explanation, and with the absolute finality of a man who has made a calculation about risk and arrived at an answer he is not interested in revisiting. He looked at Atlas for a long moment, the same look Pfeiffer had given, that assessment. And then he looked at Ethan, and something crossed his face that might have been apology or might have been recognition. "I can't," he said. "I understand," Victor said. "No." Buell shook his head once, slowly. "You don't." He looked at Ethan. "You might." He closed the door. They stood on the porch in the rain. Victor's hand tightened on the walker's grip once, briefly, and then relaxed. "He'll come around," Ethan said. "He might not." "He might not," Ethan agreed. They walked back to the car through the wet, and Atlas stayed close to Victor the whole way without being directed, matching the old man's pace with the unhurried patience of a dog who has decided that this is where he is needed. That night, Ethan sat in the truck outside the marine yard after Pete had locked up and made a call to a number in his contacts he hadn't used in 2 years. Danny Reyes, former 1st Recon, 3 deployments, currently working investigative security consulting in Portland, the kind of man who understood the difference between legal and lawful and had never confused the two. "Mercer," Danny said. "You alive?" "Yeah, you busy?" "I'm always busy. What do you need?" "I need to know who owns Ardmore Group LLC past the LLC. A pause. "That kind of question or a different kind?" "The legitimate kind, public records, whatever's findable." "Okay." Another pause. "This about the thing on the video?" "You saw it." "Everyone saw it. You look like you're about to breach a room." "I wasn't." "I know. That's why it's interesting." The sound of something being written. "Give me 3 days. I have 15. Then I'll take 2. A beat. "The dog looks good on camera." Ethan looked at Atlas in the passenger seat, who was watching a plastic bag move in the wind with the meditative focus of an animal with nothing to prove. "He's always looked good," Ethan said. Sunday morning, he went to the Anchor. Emma Brooks was working the lunch setup, arranging sugar caddies along the counter with the mechanical efficiency of a person whose hands know the job well enough to do it, while the mind is somewhere else entirely. She was younger than he'd placed her in his memory of the diner incident, mid-20s, slight, dark-haired, with the particular careful watchfulness of someone who has learned to take inventory of rooms. She saw him come in. She saw Atlas. Something moved across her face, not quite fear, not quite relief, and then she went back to the sugar caddies. He sat at the counter. Margie was off on Sundays. A different woman brought him coffee without warmth and moved away. Ethan drank it and waited. After about 4 minutes, Emma set a sugar caddy at the end of the counter near him and didn't leave. "You're the man from last week," she said quietly, without looking at him. "Yes." "You know about the video?" "Yes." A pause. She repositioned the caddy an inch to the left for no structural reason. "I deleted it off my phone," she said. "Same night. Someone told me, I don't know how they knew, but someone called me and told me if I posted it anywhere, there would be consequences." She looked up. Her eyes were steady, but there was something brittle under them. "My mother lives on Aldrich Street." "I know Roy Pfeiffer," Ethan said. Something shifted in her expression. "He's okay?" "He's fighting." She was quiet for a moment. "I backed the video up before I deleted it, put it on a flash drive." A pause. "But 3 days ago I came home and my apartment had been searched. Nothing taken. The drive was gone." Ethan set down his coffee cup. "There might be another copy," she said. I emailed it to myself. Old account, one I haven't used in years, but I don't know if they can access that." "Don't access it from your phone or your home computer," Ethan said immediately. "Not yet." She looked at him. "You sound like you know what you're doing." "I know enough to know when not to move." She picked up the caddy and moved 3 feet down the counter. Then she came back. "There's something else," she said. "The officer, Crusoe. He comes in here. Thursdays, usually. And when he does, he sits where he can see the back office." She kept her voice flat and even and low. "Our manager has been meeting with someone. I don't know who. But it started about a month ago, and after each meeting, my manager gets very quiet for the rest of the shift. And the next morning, there's always something new that needs my attention in a different part of the building. He's keeping you away from the office. That's what it feels like. She straightened. I don't know what it means. It means you're already part of this whether you want to be or not, Ethan said. The question is just which side of it you're standing on. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the coffee pot and refilled his cup with the focused care of someone performing a normal action in order to hold something normal in their hands. I haven't decided yet, she said. That's fair, he said. Take your time. He did not tell her that time was the one thing he was fairly sure none of them had much of. Atlas, under the counter stool, had placed his chin on his forepaws and was watching the diner door with the forward-tilted, patient attention of a dog who has learned that the thing worth watching is rarely the obvious thing, and that what matters is being ready when it moves. At 3:17 that afternoon, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. We know what Hale told you. Last warning. He read it twice. Then he called Victor. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He was in the truck and moving before he'd made any conscious decision to move, Atlas shifting his weight in the passenger seat as Ethan pulled out, and the rain was coming down again the way it had been coming down all week, patient and relentless. And as he drove south toward the Bayview Motor Lodge, he was running the problem the way he'd run problems in the field. Not with panic, not with speed, but with the particular cold efficiency of a man who has learned that the difference between a bad outcome and a worse one is usually measured in the 60 seconds before anyone else has started thinking. Victor's car was in the lot. The door to room 7 was open 2 inches, light spilling out into the wet afternoon. Atlas was already out of the truck before Ethan had the door fully open, moving toward room 7 without a sound, nose working, ears forward, tail still. The posture Ethan recognized from 6 years of working alongside him in conditions far worse than a parking lot in November rain. The posture that meant someone had been here. The door to room 7 was open 2 inches and the light inside was wrong. Ethan knew it before he could name it, something in the angle of the lamp, the way the shadow fell across the threshold, suggested the room had been disturbed and then hastily reassembled by people who understood the concept of tidying without understanding the specific logic of how this particular man organized his space. Victor was precise. Victor's room would be precise. The shadow said it wasn't anymore. Atlas stopped at the threshold and held. That was the signal. Not aggression, not alarm, just the complete cessation of forward movement that meant the dog had collected enough information from the air in front of him to require a pause for processing. Ethan put his hand flat on the door and pushed it open the rest of the way. Victor was in the chair by the window, alive, upright, with a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried to a dark streak along his jaw. He was holding a damp washcloth to it with one hand and looking at Ethan with the expression of a man who is angry with himself in a very specific and controlled way. I'm all right, he said, before Ethan crossed the threshold. You're not all right. Ethan came in and did the room in 3 seconds. Bathroom door open, clear. Closet open, clear. Window locked. Nothing disturbed badly enough to suggest a prolonged search, which meant either they'd found what they were looking for quickly or they'd known exactly where to look. How many? 2. They weren't here to hurt me. Victor lowered the washcloth. The cut was shallow, a knock against the doorframe when they'd moved him to the chair. They were here to take the box. Ethan looked at this table where the cardboard file box had sat during their kitchen session. The table was empty. The copies, he said. All physical copies, yes. Victor's voice was careful and even, the voice of a man doing a damage assessment without letting the damage become panic. The flash drives from my bag. The photographs. The violation notice copies. He paused. They were thorough. How long ago? 20 minutes before you arrived. Maybe 25. Ethan pulled out his phone and called Danny Reyes. It rang twice. I need you to accelerate, Ethan said. I'm already accelerating. What happened? Victor Hale's room was tossed. Physical evidence taken. He's physically okay. They're escalating. A pause. How escalated? They went into a 78-year-old man's motel room and took his files and knocked him into a doorframe. Ethan kept his voice flat. I'd say fairly escalated. Okay? Danny's voice had shifted, that familiar compression of tone that happened when he moved from conversation to operational. I've got your LLC information. It goes 3 layers deep. Ardmore is a subsidiary of a holding company called Vantage Development Partners, which is registered in Delaware. The operating principal of Vantage is a man named Randall Voss, public-facing, clean record. But Vantage has 2 silent partners. One of them is a former city councilman from Brierton County named Gerald Seff, who sits on 3 regional planning bodies. A pause. The other one I'm still unpacking, but the initial paperwork points to someone with a municipal law enforcement background. Ethan was looking at Victor when Danny said that last part, and Victor was looking back at him, and neither of them spoke. Send me everything, Ethan said. Already moving. Mercer. These people have resources. If they're moving on physical evidence, they're worried. Worried people do stupid things, but they also do dangerous things. I know. Watch the old man. I'm watching. He ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed facing Victor, and Atlas moved to stand beside the old man's chair in the quiet, deliberate way he'd been doing all week with the people who needed it. Someone with a law enforcement background, Victor said. He wasn't asking. Yeah. Victor pressed the washcloth to his eyebrow again. His hands were steady, which Ethan found he respected enormously. There's something you don't know yet, Victor said. Something I haven't told you because I wanted to be certain before I said it. He looked at Ethan steadily. The Planning Commission member who has been administratively processing every violation notice on that map, every single one, for 18 months, is Dale Crusoe's uncle. His name is Bernard Crusoe. He has been on the Planning Commission for 11 years. Ethan absorbed this. So the officers provide the street pressure, he said. The uncle provides the administrative mechanism. And someone with a law enforcement background is the quiet partner in the LLC that benefits from the property transfers. That's the architecture, Victor said. It's why nothing has surfaced. Each piece looks like normal institutional function from the outside. It only becomes visible when you put the pieces together. We need to put them together in a room full of people who can do something with it. Yes. Victor lowered the washcloth. The bleeding had stopped. And we need to do it before they decide that taking files isn't sufficient. Ethan moved Victor out of the Bayview that night. He didn't ask permission. He came back at 7 with his truck and told Victor to pack what was essential. And Victor, to his credit, did not argue, did not negotiate, just opened his bag and began making the selections of a man who has lived mobile long enough to know what essential actually means. It took him 11 minutes, which Ethan thought was good time for a 78-year-old with a walker and a fresh head wound. He installed Victor in the small bedroom at the back of his parents' house, the room that had been a guest room for 20 years and smelled faintly of cedar and old wool, over Claire's brief, pointed silence, which Ethan understood to mean she had concerns and had decided to register them later rather than in front of the old man. She registered them in the kitchen at 10:15 while Ethan made coffee. For how long, she said, until this is done. And when is this done? I don't know yet. Claire sat at the kitchen table and looked at the space where the foreclosure envelope had been. He'd moved it to a drawer, which she'd noticed. Marcus asked me this morning why you look like you're planning something. What did you tell him? I told him you were working on a problem. She folded her hands on the table. He said that's what you always look like the problem is right in front of you, and everyone else just hasn't seen it yet. She paused. He said it like it was a good thing. Ethan poured 2 coffees and set one in front of her. It's not always a good thing, he said. No. She wrapped her hands around the mug. But it's you. A pause. Just don't get this man hurt worse than he already is. He's somebody's father somewhere. He doesn't have family. Then don't let this town be the last thing that happens to him. Ethan looked at his sister for a moment, and then he drank his coffee and didn't say anything, because some things you register and carry rather than answer. So, the week that followed moved in 2 registers simultaneously. On the surface, Greyhaven Point was a November coastal town doing what November coastal towns do. The fishing fleet running in and out in the gray mornings, the summer businesses dark and locked, the year-round residents moving between work and home with their heads down against the weather. The Anchor Diner opened at 6. The Marine Yard opened at 7. School ran, the hospital ran, the Planning Commission met on its scheduled Tuesday and recorded its minutes. Underneath that surface, Things were moving. Danny's files arrived in encrypted batches: corporate filings, property transfer records, the financial architecture of Vantage Development Partners, laid out in the particular bloodless language of LLCs and registered agents and operating agreements. Ethan spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table with Victor going through it page by page, and what emerged was a picture that was simultaneously simpler and uglier than the pieces had suggested. A coordinated acquisition strategy targeting a specific demographic: elderly, veteran, disabled, asset poor, using manufactured violations to create financial distress, then offering below-market buyouts presented as mercy. 11 completed acquisitions in Greyhaven Point, 7 more in various stages. The completed properties had been consolidated, renovated, and resold at between 2.3 and 4 times the acquisition price. "It's not sophisticated," Victor said on the second evening. "It's just patient." "Patient and protected," Ethan said. "Yes." Victor turned a page. "The protection is the machinery. Without Bernard Crusoe on the commission, and without whoever the law enforcement partner is, this is just aggressive real estate. With them, it becomes a system." They still didn't have the law enforcement partner identified. Danny was running down 3 possibilities, all of them requiring careful approach. Meanwhile, witnesses were getting nervous. Roy Pfeiffer called on Tuesday morning to say that his truck had been sideswiped overnight in his driveway. Deliberately, he believed, based on the angle of the damage. And that when he'd called to report it, the officer who responded had spent more time asking questions about his recent associations than about the vehicle. Dorothea Crane called Wednesday to say that her written statement, which she'd spent 3 days composing and had stored on her kitchen desk, was missing. Nothing else in the house had been touched. Carl Buell on Morrison Street did not call, but when Ethan drove past his house on Thursday, he noticed that the curtains were drawn in the middle of the afternoon, which they hadn't been before. The pattern was clear. They were narrowing the space, reducing the options, applying just enough pressure to keep people afraid without giving anyone a specific documentable threat to point to. It was the same mechanism as the property scheme itself. Each individual action defensible in isolation, only visible as what it was when you assembled the whole picture. Ethan spent Thursday morning at the Marine Yard running diagnostics on a trawler engine with half his attention and the other half on the problem. And when Pete appeared at the bay door mid-morning, he looked at Ethan with the careful expression he'd been wearing for 2 weeks. "Harbor Master's office called again," Pete said. "Same suggestion. Different framing. This time it was about a noise ordinance complaint from the residential area to the east." He paused. "We don't have a residential area to the east. It's all boatyard." "They're not being subtle anymore." "No." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Whatever you're doing, I want you to know I'm not going to do what they're asking." Ethan looked at him. "Pete, I'm 62 years old, and I've run this yard for 31 years. He said it flat and plain. "I'm not taking suggestions from people who call my business line to protect a real estate scheme." He went back inside before Ethan could respond, which was Pete's way, the statement complete in itself, needing no acknowledgement. Emma Brooks called on Friday afternoon. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not at the diner, not at your house." They met at the park on Clement, which by now Ethan had begun to think of as a kind of neutral zone, public enough to be safe, exposed enough that surveillance was visible. He arrived first, same bench, same sightline. Atlas settled on the pavement beside him and put his nose in the wind. Emma came from the south end of the path, walking quickly, hands in her jacket pockets. She sat on the far end of the bench and looked at the harbor and didn't speak immediately. "I remembered something," she said finally, "about the flash drive." Ethan waited. "I had 2. I forgot. I bought them in a 2-pack from the pharmacy in September, put them both in my work bag, and then didn't think about it again. When I made the backup, I used the one from my pocket." She paused. "The other one was in the bottom of my bag the whole time, inside a zipper compartment I never use. When they searched my apartment, they took the drive from my desk drawer." She looked at him. "They didn't find the bag." Ethan was very still. "The second drive," he said. "I don't know if the file transferred to it. I don't know if I copied it over or just thought about copying it over. It was a bad night. I was scared. I'm not completely sure what I actually did." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "But the drive exists." "Where is it?" "The bag is at my mother's house. I brought it there last week because I didn't feel safe keeping things at my apartment anymore. She looked at him directly. I haven't told her what's in it. I haven't opened the bag. Don't, he said. Not yet. Not until we know what we have. She nodded. Then she said quietly, My mother's been getting letters from a law firm about her house. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at the harbor, at the working water, at the gray and ordinary distance of it. They're saying the property value assessment has triggered an automatic review of her tax obligations, and that she may be facing a significant back payment. Her voice was careful and level, and controlled in the way that voices go controlled when someone is keeping a large feeling in a small container. She called me crying. She doesn't understand the language. She thinks she's done something wrong. Atlas had moved from beside Ethan to beside Emma with no instruction, arriving at her feet with the quiet competence of a dog who reads the change in a room before the room knows it has changed. She looked down at him. Her hand went to the top of his head, almost involuntarily, and she held it there. She hasn't done anything wrong, Ethan said. I know. And we're going to need that drive. She looked up. Something in her face had shifted. Not the controlled expression, but something under it. Something that had made a decision. My mother's house, she said. I'll meet you there. The drive existed. It was in the bottom of the zippered compartment, exactly where Emma had said, still in its pharmacy packaging, and when they plugged it into Victor's laptop on the kitchen table that evening, with all four of them present, Ethan, Victor, Emma, and Claire, who had not been asked to stay, but had positioned herself in the kitchen doorway in the way of someone who has decided this is her house, and she will stand where she wants to stand in it. The file was there. 43 seconds of video. It wasn't clean footage. Shot from a counter stool at an angle, partially obscured by a napkin dispenser, the audio mixed with diner noise and rain. But it was clear enough. Clear enough to see Crusoe move the mug. Clear enough to see the walker go down and neither officer move. Clear enough to see the way the tall officer spoke to the old man and the particular satisfaction in his face when he did it. And clear enough to see Ethan come out of the back booth, a tall man in a work jacket, moving with that particular economy of motion, picking up the walker, setting it right, and then standing between the officers and the old man with the stillness of someone who has decided the situation is now different and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Atlas was visible in the frame for 4 seconds, moving through the lower edge of the shot toward Victor's stool. In those 4 seconds, he was more expressive than most humans Ethan had observed in similar situations. The forward ears, the precise positioning, the complete unambiguous communication of I am here and I have decided where I stand. Nobody spoke when the video ended. Then Emma said, I need to make more copies. Yes, Victor said, immediately. Different formats, different locations. I have a laptop at my mother's, Emma said, and a friend in Portsmouth who owes me a favor. Send it to Danny Reyes, Ethan said, and gave her the number. Emma took out her phone and began working, and Claire watched from the doorway for a moment and then went to make tea, which was her version of saying, this is happening in my house, and I accept it. Victor sat back in his chair and looked at the dark laptop screen and then at Ethan, and his face was doing something complicated. Not triumph, too old for triumph, but something like the particular relief of a man who has spent a long time believing in something he couldn't yet prove and has now held the proof in his hands. It's not enough by itself, Ethan said. No, Victor agreed immediately. But it's a center. Evidence needs a center. Without it, everything else is just circumstance with opinions attached. The community meeting, Ethan said. You mentioned it. Yes. I've been contacting people quietly. There are 14 residents who've indicated willingness to speak in a public forum. Not sign statements, not go on record with the county, but speak to each other in the same room and let a room full of witnesses hear the pattern. He paused. It's not legal evidence, but it's a different kind of record. When? The community room at the library. I've booked it under my name for next Thursday evening. He glanced at Ethan. I'd like you there. I'll be there. And Atlas. Atlas goes where I go. The week before the meeting was the worst of it. On Monday, Ethan arrived at the marine yard to find that his tool locker had been broken into overnight. Nothing taken. The tools were untouched, which was the point. The break-in was a message, not a theft. We can get to your things. On Tuesday, Marcus came home from school and told Claire that a man had been sitting in a car outside the schoolyard during afternoon recess. A man just sitting there, not getting out, just sitting. Claire called Ethan. Ethan drove to the school and then drove the perimeter of 3 blocks around it, and then sat in his truck outside the school for 2 hours until Marcus was safely home. And while he sat there, he felt something changing in himself. Not anger exactly, more the absence of all the moderating voices that had been running alongside the anger, the reasonable ones that said, stay measured, stay procedural, don't give them cause. Those voices were getting quieter. The thing underneath them was not. He called Victor that evening. They're putting pressure on Marcus, he said. Without preamble, without context, Victor would know what he meant. A silence. I know, Victor said. I'm sorry, Ethan. Don't apologize. Just tell me we're close enough that this ends before it escalates further. The meeting is Thursday. A pause. After that, I intend to approach the State Attorney General's office directly. I have a contact there, someone who will listen. But I need the meeting first. I need the room full of people on record. Okay? Ethan. Victor's voice was careful. I need you to stay contained until Thursday. A pause. I know what that costs, Victor added. I'm asking anyway. Ethan looked at Atlas, who was on the back porch watching the dark perimeter of the yard with his quiet, total attention. Thursday, he said. Wednesday evening, Roy Pfeiffer called. I'm coming, he said. No preamble. The meeting, I'm coming. Good, Ethan said. I want to bring someone. Neighbor of mine, Margaret Holt, 71, widow. Her house is on your map. She hasn't spoken to anyone yet. Bring her. She's scared. I know. Bring her anyway. A pause. You gonna be there? You and the dog? Yes. Another pause, shorter this time. Okay, Pfeiffer said, and hung up. Carl Buell called an hour later. Ethan almost didn't answer because the number came up unknown, and then something made him answer it. Morrison Street, Buell said. I know who you are. A long silence on the line. Ethan could hear wind through a bad seal on a window, which meant Buell was standing near an exterior wall. They visited me again, Buell said. Yesterday. Told me the community meeting was a bad idea. Told me anyone who attended would be making their situation worse. How did they know about the meeting? I don't know. A pause. But I wanted you to know they know. Ethan was already across the kitchen, pulling out the notepad where he'd written the meeting logistics. I'm calling the library. We need to change the confirmed attendees' communication. It's too late for that, Buell said quietly. They already know who's planning to come. Another silence. I'm going to be there anyway. I want you to know that. Whatever they said to me, I'm going to be there anyway. Ethan stopped moving. Morrison Street, Buell said again, and this time it wasn't his address. It was something else. An identification of what he'd carried home from 2 tours in the Gulf and never quite put down. I'm done being quiet. I'll see you Thursday, Ethan said. Thursday came cold and overcast, which was appropriate. The community room at the Greyhaven Public Library held 60 people comfortably. By 7:15, there were 43 in the chairs and more in the doorway, and the particular sound the room made, the low, careful, slightly stunned murmur of people who have been isolated with a problem and have suddenly discovered they are not isolated, was something Ethan felt in his chest rather than heard. Victor stood at the front of the room near a folding table, his walker to one side. He had dressed carefully for this. A pressed shirt, his veteran's lapel pin, the deliberate presentation of a man who understands that how you stand tells people whether it's safe to stand with you. His face still showed the faint shadow of the cut above his eyebrow, healed to a thin line now, and he had not covered it with anything, which Ethan also noticed. Emma was near the side wall with a legal pad, writing. Roy Pfeiffer sat in the second row with Margaret Holt beside him, a small woman in a blue cardigan who held her purse in her lap with both hands, and looked at the room with the expression of someone for whom simply being here has cost something real. Carl Buell was in the back row, arms folded, jaw set, present. Dorothea Crane sat in the third row and had brought 2 neighbors Ethan didn't know. Ethan stood at the back of the room near the door with Atlas beside him, and when Victor looked to the back and found him there, Victor gave him a single nod. the small, specific nod of a man confirming that the perimeter is held. Victor began speaking. He was not a dramatic speaker. He was a precise one. He laid out the pattern in plain language, the timeline, the properties, the mechanism, and he did it in the way of someone who trusts that the facts, properly arranged, are more affecting than any performance of them. And he was right. The room got very quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when people stop waiting for the speaker to tell them how to feel and start feeling it themselves. Then he asked who wanted to speak. Margaret Holt went first, which surprised everyone, including, apparently, herself. She stood up with her purse still in her hands and said in a voice that started small and got stronger as it went, "They told me my foundation had subsidence. I've lived in that house for 37 years, and nobody ever mentioned subsidence." She paused. "My husband built that house. He was a carpenter. He would have known." She sat down. The room breathed. Then Pfeiffer stood. Then Dorothea. Then two people Ethan didn't know, then three more, then a man in the back who started crying halfway through what he was saying and finished it anyway, which was a kind of courage Ethan recognized and respected without being able to name it exactly. Carl Buell didn't stand. He sat in his back row chair with his arms folded and listened to everyone else, and at the end of it, he was still sitting that way. But something in his face was different, looser, somehow, like a joint that has been held against its range of motion for too long, and has finally, carefully, been allowed to move. The meeting ran 90 minutes. At the end of it, Victor announced that the materials would be compiled and presented to the State Attorney General's office, and that a formal request for investigation would be filed the following week. He said it in the same plain, factual tone he'd used throughout, and the room received it with the particular cautious stillness of people who have wanted something for a long time and are afraid to want it too much in case it doesn't come. Ethan was watching Victor at the front of the room. The slight tremor in his left hand that had been there all evening, the careful management of his breathing, the specific way he was holding himself together through what Ethan now recognized as significant physical effort, when it happened. Victor stopped mid-sentence. The pause was wrong. Not the pause of a man choosing his next word, but the pause of a man whose sentence has been interrupted by something internal and urgent, and for a fraction of a second his face showed something unguarded and frightened that Ethan had not seen on it before. Then he reached for the table with both hands. Ethan was already moving through the room when Victor's knees went. He got there fast enough. He got both arms around the old man before he hit the floor, and they went down together in a controlled way, Ethan absorbing the weight, and Victor was conscious but gray-faced and sweating, and when Ethan put his hand on Victor's chest he could feel the heart going wrong. Too fast, irregular, not the reliable thud of a working pump, but something stuttering and afraid. "Call 911, he said, loud and flat, and carrying to every corner of the room. "Now!" 3 people moved at once. Emma was already on her phone. Atlas had come through the room behind Ethan and was now sitting close to Victor's head, not touching, just present, while Ethan kept one hand on Victor's sternum and the other on his wrist, and talked to him. Not the medic talk, not the clinical talk, just plain and steady and close. "Stay here. I've got you. You don't have to do anything right now. I've got you." Until the sound of the sirens came up from Harbor View, and the room around them held its collective breath, and the 43 people who had stood up that evening in that room sat in their chairs and were very still and did not look away. Victor's hand found Ethan's arm. His grip was weak, but it was deliberate. "Don't let it stop," he said. His voice was thin, but his eyes were clear. "It won't stop," Ethan said. The grip tightened very slightly. Then the paramedics came through the door and Ethan moved back to give them room, and Atlas stayed beside Victor while the paramedics worked, and nobody in the room told the dog to move, and the dog didn't move. Victor survived the night. That was the first thing Ethan knew when he woke at 4:30 in the chair beside the hospital bed, Atlas on the floor at his feet, the cardiac monitor doing its steady, reliable work in the half-dark of the room. The second thing he knew was that the doctor, a woman named Reyes, who had the particular economy of motion of someone who has been on shift too long and is running on competence rather than energy, had used the phrase significant cardiac event with the careful emphasis of someone who wants you to understand the word significant without using the word serious, because serious opens a door. She's not ready to open for you yet. Victor was asleep. He looked smaller in the hospital bed than he did anywhere else. which Ethan supposed was true of most people but felt specifically wrong for this man, like a reduction that the architecture of him was protesting even in sleep. The veteran's lapel pin was on the bedside table where a nurse had placed it when she'd helped him out of his shirt. The room was very quiet. Ethan sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them and looked at the monitor and thought about what Victor had said on the floor of the community room. Don't let it stop. He hadn't asked what it meant. He knew what it meant. At 6:15, Claire texted to say Marcus was at school and she was covering the morning shift. At 6:40, Danny Reyes called. Ethan stepped into the hallway. I have the third partner, Danny said. Without preamble, the way he'd operated in the field. The relevant information first, context after. Who? Former county sheriff. Retired 4 years ago. Name is Howard Briggs. He ran Greyhaven County for 9 years before retirement, and 6 months after he left office, he showed up as a founding silent partner in Vantage Development Partners. A pause. He's also Dale Crusoe's former field training officer. Ethan stood in the hospital corridor and let that settle. Crusoe's uncle on the planning commission. Crusoe's former FTO as the silent partner. The scheme wasn't just protected by institutional relationships, it was built from them, bone by bone, over years. Can you document the partnership? Ethan asked. Delaware filing records. It's public, it's just not the kind of public that makes itself findable without knowing what you're looking for. Danny paused. I also found something else. Briggs has a meeting scheduled next week. It's in the county building calendar as a planning consultation, but the address registered for the other party in the meeting is an Ardmore Group subsidiary. When? Friday, 2 o'clock. The city council chambers. They use it for smaller meetings when the main hearing room is in use. That's the same building where the city hearing is. What city hearing? Ethan told him about the council session, Ardmore's redevelopment proposal, the formal public presentation that Victor had been working toward as the venue for the community's response. It was scheduled for Friday morning at 10. He hadn't known, until this moment, that Briggs had a meeting in the same building 6 hours later. A long pause on the line. Mercer, Danny said, that's not a coincidence. No. If the hearing goes badly for them, if the video plays, if the testimony lands, Briggs and Voss need a contingency. Something that moves fast. Another pause. An emergency meeting in the same building, same afternoon is a contingency. What kind of contingency? I don't know. But I'd want someone in that building after 10 o'clock who knows how to watch a room. Ethan looked through the window into Victor's room. The monitor. The lapel pin on the table. The old man's hands resting open on the blanket. The particular open-palmed stillness of someone who has given everything they had and is waiting to see if it was enough. I'll be there, Ethan said. Victor was awake by 8. He looked at the ceiling for a while before he looked at Ethan, which Ethan understood to be the particular orientation process of a man who has woken somewhere unfamiliar and is assembling the facts in order before he commits to any reaction. The meeting, Victor said. It was good, Ethan said. Everyone spoke. Emma got it on the legal pad. We have names and statements. The video. Still secure, multiple copies. A pause. Victor looked at the monitor. I'm going to the hearing Friday. You're in a hospital. I'm aware of where I am. His voice was thin, but it had not lost its particular precision. I'm going to the hearing. Victor. Ethan. The old man looked at him, and there was something in his face now that hadn't been there before. Something that had broken open a little during the night and was showing itself in the specific way that things show themselves when the filters are down and the machinery is tired. There is something I have not told you, something I should have told you weeks ago, and I didn't because I was waiting for the right moment, and then I kept waiting, and that is a habit of mine that has cost me things before. He paused. His hands moved slightly on the blanket. I need to tell you before Friday. Ethan pulled his chair closer to the bed. During my second tour, Victor said, 1969. I was Army, but I was attached to a combined unit operating near the Quezon Valley. Mixed Army and Marine, which was not common, but it happened when the tactical situation required it. He stopped. His breathing was careful and deliberate. We were overrun. Not a firefight. An overrun, which is a different thing. We lost the perimeter in less than 4 minutes, and it became a matter of individuals and small elements surviving contact, rather than a coordinated defense. Ethan said nothing. A Marine found me. I had taken 2 rounds, one in the left leg, one through the right shoulder, and I was in a drainage ditch that was filling with water, and I was going to drown in it or bleed out in it, one of the two. Victor's voice was even, too even, the way voices go when a man has told himself a story enough times that the emotion has been worn smooth. He pulled me out, carried me 300 meters under fire to a landing zone, and held the position with one other man until the extraction arrived. He paused. I never got his name that night. Too much noise, too much chaos. By the time we were on the helicopter, I had lost too much blood to form reliable memories. But you found him, Ethan said. I spent 40 years looking. Intermittently. Life interrupts. You put things down. You pick them up again. A pause. The Marine Corps records from that period are incomplete. The operation we were on is classified even now, which means the personnel records are restricted. I found partial rosters. I found after-action fragments. He stopped again. His hands had closed on the blanket edge. 3 months ago, I found a casualty record. The Marine who pulled me out of that ditch died in 1987. Cardiac arrest. A pause. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was from Greyhaven Point, Maine. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Ethan sat very still. I came here looking for his family, Victor said. That's why I was in Greyhaven Point. That's why I was at that diner that morning. I'd been eating there every day for a week because I'd learned it was the kind of place where people talk, and I was hoping someone would mention the Mercer name. He looked at Ethan. And then a man named Ethan Mercer walked out of a back booth and stood between me and 2 officers who outweighed him combined, and his dog moved before he did, and He stopped. His jaw worked once. I needed to be certain before I said anything. I needed to verify. Did you? Your discharge papers, Victor said quietly. You had them in the kitchen file box. I looked the night you brought me to your house when you were making coffee. I should have asked. I didn't ask. A pause. Daniel Mercer's son, listed as next of kin. The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at his hands for a long moment. At the floor. At Atlas, who was watching him with the complete unhurried attention of a dog who has decided that whatever is happening is important. He never talked about it, Ethan said. The war. Nothing. They didn't, mostly. He fixed engines. Ethan's voice was neutral in the way that voices go neutral when they're carrying something very heavy and the speaker is concentrating on not dropping it. Marine Yard, same one I work in now. He could diagnose an engine problem by sound. Swore he could hear the difference between a worn bearing and a scored cylinder wall. He paused. He used to walk the harbor at 4 in the morning. I thought it was insomnia. He never explained. No, Victor said. They didn't, mostly. A long silence. Outside the hospital window, Greyhaven Point was going about its morning. The gray harbor, the working boats, the November sky doing its patient, indifferent thing. He saved your life, Ethan said. Yes. And you came here to find his family. Yes. Ethan looked at the old man in the hospital bed, at the lapel pin on the table, at the specific, tired, open face of a man who has been carrying something for 50 years and has finally set it down in the right room. Okay, Ethan said. It wasn't the most articulate response available to him. He was aware of this, but Victor seemed to understand it in the complete way that it was meant, because something in the old man's face changed. Not relief exactly, more like the particular exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has finally, cautiously, stopped. Friday, Victor said. Friday, Ethan agreed. The city council chambers occupied the top floor of the Greyhaven Municipal Building, a converted Victorian on Harborview that the town had been using for civic functions since 1923, and maintaining with the particular grudging adequacy of a community that knows something is important but can't quite afford to treat it that way. The hearing room held 200 people in folding chairs, a raised dais for the council, a presentation area with a projection screen and podium, and windows on the harbor side that let in a cold gray light that on this particular Friday morning made everything look simultaneously important and uncertain. By 9:40, it was standing room. Ethan had not expected standing room. He'd expected the modest turnout of a civic meeting in a small town in November, 20, 30 people. The usual mix of the engaged and the professionally obligated. What he found when he arrived at 9:20 was a room already three-quarters full, and not full of the usual faces. Full of the faces from Thursday's meeting. Full of Margaret Holt in her blue cardigan, sitting beside Roy Pfeiffer, who had driven her, and who had his big merchant marine hands on his knees with the deliberate stillness of a man controlling his demeanor by act of will. Full of Dorothea Crane and her two neighbors. Full of Carl Buell in the back, arms folded again, same posture, different face. Full of people Ethan didn't recognize who had nonetheless come, which meant the word had traveled further than the Thursday room. Emma Brooks was near the front with her legal pad and her phone, and when she saw Ethan come in, she gave him a look that said, "I don't know how this goes," and he gave her one back that said, "Neither do I, but we're here." Atlas drew attention coming through the door. He always did, the size and the gray muzzle and the particular way he moved, and Ethan watched people's faces change when they saw the dog. Not alarmed, something closer to reassured. The same thing Pfeiffer and Dorothea had done, that same instinctive recalibration. He took a position along the side wall with a sightline to the door and the dais both. At 9:50, Victor Hale came in. He had discharged himself from the hospital that morning over the documented objection of the attending physician, which he had accomplished by signing 3 forms and saying, with the particular calm of a man who has been in significantly worse places than a hospital room, that he understood the risks and accepted them and needed his walker returned. Claire had called Ethan to report this with the tone of a woman who finds the situation both alarming and, against her better judgment, somewhat admirable. He moved through the room slowly, and the room parted for him and closed behind him with the specific attentiveness that crowds give to people who are clearly carrying something significant. He took a chair near the front, set his walker to the side, and sat straight. The hearing began at 10. Ardmore's presentation was polished. Randall Voss wasn't there in person. He'd sent a VP named Preston Carr, 40-something, in a suit that cost more than most people in the room made in a month, who spoke in the smooth, confident cadence of someone who has given this presentation in other rooms and received the anticipated response. Renderings of the proposed development lit up the screen, a mixed-use complex where 43 properties currently stood, promising jobs, tax revenue, architectural harmony with the historic waterfront character, a pedestrian promenade along the harbor. It was a good presentation. Ethan gave it that. In a different room, in different circumstances, it would have landed. Carr finished. He smiled at the council. The smile said, "This is the part where you ask a few questions, and then we move to approval." The council chair, a woman named Patricia Sutter, who had the compressed energy of someone doing 3 jobs and refusing to let any of them be done badly, looked at her agenda. "We'll open for public comment," she said. Carr's smile held, but something behind it shifted, almost imperceptibly. Margaret Holt stood up first. Her voice started small again, the way it had Thursday, and got stronger. She talked about her husband building the house. She talked about the foundation notice, and the 2 independent assessors, and the subsequent electrical panel citation, and the law firm's letter about the tax reassessment. She talked about it plainly and specifically, with dates and amounts. And she held her purse in both hands the whole time like an anchor, and when she sat down, the room was very quiet. Roy Pfeiffer didn't stand up. He stayed in his chair and said his piece from there, loud enough to carry to the back of the room, with the flat directional accuracy of a man used to making himself heard over engine noise and weather. He talked about the officer who'd come to his house in a personal vehicle. He said the word suggest with a specific inflection that made its meaning very clear. Dorothea Crane spoke. 2 of her neighbors spoke. A man Ethan didn't know stood up and said he'd been told by a planning commission staffer, he named the staffer, that his appeal would go better if he contacted a particular real estate agent about his options. He had the staffer's name written on a piece of paper that he held up. Carl Buell stood up from the back row. The room turned. He said 3 sentences. They were, "My name is Carl Buell. I live on Morrison Street and I have lived there for 22 years. 2 months ago, an officer of this town came to my door and told me that if I talked to anyone about my situation, I would regret it, and I want the council to know that I have thought about nothing but that sentence for 2 months and I am done thinking about it." He sat down. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room that has stopped waiting. Emma stood up. She didn't speak first. She walked to the front of the room and plugged a flash drive into the presentation laptop, and the screen that had been showing Ardmore's harbor promenade went dark, and then it showed the Anchor Diner on a rainy morning, shot from a counter stool at an angle, partially obscured by a napkin dispenser. Carr said, "I don't think this is public comment period," Patricia Sutter said, without looking at him. 43 seconds. The room watched Crusoe move the mug. The room watched the walker go down. The room watched two uniformed officers stand there while a 78-year-old veteran sat on a diner stool unable to reach his own coffee. And then the room watched a man come out of the back booth and pick up the walker and set it right and stand in the space between the officers and the old man with a stillness that communicated, without any words, that the calculation had changed. And for 4 seconds, a German Shepherd moved through the lower edge of the frame. The recording ended. 3 reporters were in the room. Ethan had seen them come in and hadn't known what to make of it. Local paper, a regional TV crew, and one he didn't recognize. He understood now that Victor had made calls, that the reporters were not coincidental. Their cameras had been running. Carr was on his feet talking to someone on his phone, and his composure had cracked enough at the edges to show what was under it, which was the controlled panic of a man watching a careful construction come apart faster than he can respond. Victor stood up. It took him a moment. His hands on the walker, the joint-by-joint process, the careful balancing. But he got up on the first attempt, which Ethan noticed. He walked to the front of the room and stood at the podium. He didn't use notes. He spoke for 7 minutes, and what he said in those 7 minutes was the architecture of the scheme laid out in plain language. The violation pattern, the timeline, the property transfers, the corporate structure of Ardmore and Vantage, and the name Howard Briggs delivered into a room containing 3 cameras with the precise, unhurried clarity of a man who has been building toward this sentence for 7 months and intends to get it right. He said, "Bernard Crusoe has processed every violation notice on these properties. Dale Crusoe's field training officer is a founding silent partner in the company that benefits from those violations. I am asking this council to explain that pattern or explain that it cannot." The council chair was writing. 2 of the other council members were also writing. The third was looking at his phone under the table, which was a different kind of information. Victor finished. He stepped back from the podium. He moved back toward his chair, and Ethan came off the wall and met him halfway. Not to help, just to be there. And Victor looked at him with that tired, open face. "The name landed," Ethan said quietly. "Yes." Victor sat carefully. "Now we wait." The council chair called a recess. During the recess, a man Ethan didn't recognize came through the side door of the chamber, not from the public entrance, from the administrative corridor, and made his way to where Carr was standing, and they spoke in low, fast voices with the body language of people executing a contingency. The man was in his 60s, broad-shouldered, with a particular way of carrying himself that Ethan associated with people who had spent years in positions of institutional authority. Ethan looked at the man and thought, Howard Briggs. He looked at Danny Reyes's information on his phone. The photograph Danny had sent Wednesday, a retirement ceremony photo from the county sheriff's office, 4 years old, same man. Briggs had come into the building early. Briggs looked up from his conversation with Carr, and his eyes found Ethan across the room with the specific accuracy of a man who has also been in the business of watching rooms. And for a moment they simply looked at each other, 2 men who understand what the other is. In the particular way that people who have done the same work recognize each other, even across the distance of every choice that has put them on opposite sides of the same room. Briggs looked away first. He said something to Carr that made Carr look at Ethan, and then Carr looked away, and Briggs walked back through the side door into the administrative corridor. Ethan followed. The corridor was fluorescent lit and smelled of old carpet and coffee, and it ran the length of the building's administrative wing, ending at a fire door that led out onto the side parking lot. Briggs was halfway down it when Ethan came through the door, and he stopped and turned with the ease of a man who expected to be followed and has decided how he wants that conversation to go. "Mercer," he said. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. "Briggs," Ethan said. They stood in the corridor about 15 feet apart. Atlas was beside Ethan, not in front, not aggressive, just present, tracking the man down the hall with that complete, steady attention. "That was a good presentation," Briggs said. His voice was reasonable and measured, the voice of a man who has spent years using reasonableness as a tool. Hale's been working on that for a while. 7 months. He's thorough. A pause. Doesn't change the legal situation. The violations are documented, the hearing process is procedurally correct, and the property transfers were voluntary. The dog doesn't believe you, Ethan said. Briggs looked at Atlas. Something moved in his face. I know what that dog is. What unit? First MEF. A pause. I did 2 years with the second, long time ago. He looked at Ethan. You know this doesn't end in that room. I know. Whatever Hale thinks he has, the corporate structure survives a public hearing. This goes to court. It takes years, and the people in that room don't have years. They have mortgages and deadlines, and they have each other now, Ethan said. They didn't before. That changed this morning. Something shifted in Briggs's expression. Not fear. Something that was almost, not respect, but the acknowledgement of respect's location, visible in the way a person looks at a problem they've underestimated. You're going to make this very difficult, he said. I already have, Ethan said. A pause. The hearing isn't closed, Briggs said. The council hasn't voted. There's still a process. Then stay for the process, Ethan said, or leave. But understand that whatever happens in that room, the Attorney General's office has already received Victor Hale's documentation, including your name, including the Delaware partnership records, including the meeting on your calendar for this afternoon. He paused. Canceling it now would be interesting. Keeping it would be more interesting. Briggs was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, You're not a lawyer. No. You're a marine yard worker with a German shepherd and a foreclosure notice. Yes. Ethan looked at the man steadily. And I'm standing in this hallway. The fire door at the end of the corridor opened and a council staffer appeared, looking for someone, and the moment between them shifted and broke like a current interrupted. Briggs straightened his jacket. Hale needs to be careful, he said. He's not a young man. It was the wrong thing to say. Ethan felt it land somewhere below his sternum and stay there, cold and precise. Victor Hale pulled a man out of a drainage ditch in the Queison Valley, Ethan said, his voice very quiet now. Under fire, with 2 rounds in him, 300 meters to a landing zone. He did it for a Marine he'd never met before and never saw again. A pause. That man was my father. So I know exactly how careful Victor Hale is capable of being, and I know exactly what it costs him, and I am suggesting to you, very clearly, that you not reference his health again in my presence. The corridor was very quiet. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Atlas. Then he turned and walked to the fire door and pushed through it into the cold parking lot, and the door swung closed behind him, and Ethan stood in the fluorescent corridor and let out one long, slow breath, and Atlas pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg and stayed there. From the direction of the chamber, through the wall in the distance, he could hear the hearing reconvening. The scrape of chairs, Patricia Sutter's voice calling the room to order, and he turned and walked back toward it with Atlas at his side, because whatever came next was going to happen in that room with those people, and he intended to be present for every second of it. Patricia Sutter called the room to order at 11:14, and the room came to order the way rooms do when everyone in them has already made up their mind about something and is simply waiting for the institutional process to catch up. Ethan came back through the chamber door as the council was taking their seats, and he moved to his position along the side wall, and Atlas came with him, and several people tracked the dog's movement across the room with the same instinctive attention they'd been giving him all morning, as if wherever the dog stood was a reasonable indicator of where the weight of the situation actually was. Preston Carr was still at the Ardmore table. His phone was face down in front of him, and he was sitting with the specific controlled stillness of a man who has received instructions and is waiting to execute them, which was a different posture than the confident one he'd arrived with. Patricia Sutter looked at her notes and then at the room. "We've heard public comment," she said. "The council will now deliberate." She paused. "Before we do, I want to state for the record that this council has received, as of 9:50 this morning, a communication from the State Attorney General's office indicating that a formal inquiry has been opened into the pattern of property violations and associated transactions described in the documentation submitted by Mr. Victor Hale." She said it in the flat, factual tone of a woman reading something she wants on the record verbatim. The inquiry is preliminary. No findings have been made. I'm noting it because it is relevant to the council's deliberation regarding the proposed development. Carr's face did not change, but he picked up his phone. Victor, from his chair in the front row, sat straight and did not look at Ethan. He was looking at the council dais with the patient, focused attention of a man who has done everything within his reach and has arrived at the moment where the outcome passes out of his hands and into someone else's, and who has made sufficient peace with that transfer to sit still while it happens. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Ethan had expected it to take longer. The speed itself was information. When a council moves fast, it means the political calculus has already been done and the deliberation is largely procedural performance. 2 of the 5 members spoke at length. One said almost nothing. The third, the one who had been looking at his phone under the table, but gave a brief statement supporting the development's potential economic benefits, and then went quiet when the room's response to that statement was the particular silence of 40 people declining to validate something. The vote was 4-1. The development proposal was rejected. The council voted simultaneously to request a full audit of all violation notices issued in the North Residential Corridor over the preceding 24 months, to be conducted by an independent body appointed by the county. Preston Carr gathered his materials with the efficient, expressionless movements of a professional who has lost before and knows how to leave a room. He did not look at the people who had spoken that morning. He did not look at Victor. He walked out through the main doors, and one of the reporters followed him into the hallway, and the other 2 stayed in the room. The room itself did an unusual thing. It didn't erupt. There was no cheer, no immediate release of the tension that had been building in the folding chairs since 10 o'clock. What happened instead was quieter, and Ethan thought, more accurate to what the moment actually was. People looked at each other. Margaret Holt and Roy Pfeiffer. Dorothea Crane and her neighbors. Carl Buell in the back, still with his arms folded, but his head was forward now, chin down, in the posture of a man who is looking at the floor because he needs a moment that isn't public. Emma Brooks was writing something on her legal pad, and then she stopped writing and just sat with the pen in her hand. Victor turned in his chair and looked for Ethan, and Ethan was already looking at him, and the old man nodded once, the same nod as the park bench, as the diner counter, the nod that contained more information than most people's paragraphs. Ethan nodded back. The accountability came in stages, which was how these things always came. Not a single decisive moment, but a sequence of institutional processes, each one grinding slowly and producing its result on its own timeline, indifferent to the narrative need for resolution to feel clean. Howard Briggs resigned from 2 of his 3 regional advisory positions within 10 days of the hearing. The third, he was asked to leave. The State Attorney General's inquiry, as preliminary inquiries sometimes do, broadened as it found things to broaden around. The partnership records, the timing correlations. 3 former Planning Commission staff members who had declined to speak to Victor alone, but found it less difficult to speak to investigators with subpoena authority. By February, it had become a formal investigation. Bernard Crusoe was suspended from the Planning Commission pending the outcome. The suspension was administrative and came with no admission of wrongdoing and was described in the county's press release in language so carefully neutral it said almost nothing, which itself said quite a lot. Dale Crusoe was placed on administrative leave from the Greyhaven Police Department in January, following an internal affairs review that was initiated 3 days after the hearing video received regional news coverage and then received wider coverage after that, the 43 seconds of diner footage traveling further and faster than anyone had anticipated, accumulating a particular kind of attention that formal complaints sometimes fail to generate. He was not the only officer reviewed. He was the one the review focused on. None of this was swift. None of it was clean. There were counter-filings and procedural delays, and at least 2 moments when Ethan sat in his kitchen at night with Victor's file materials spread across the table and felt the particular exhausting weight of a fight that moves in inches rather than miles. But it moved. The foreclosure notice was resolved in December, when the Veterans Assistance Loan that had been flagged for additional review was, following the state inquiry's disclosure that the flag had originated from a county official connected to the Briggs network, unflagged, processed, and approved within 11 days. Ethan made the back payment on the 17th, standing at a bank counter with a cashier's check, and drove home through the gray December afternoon and sat in his truck in the driveway for a few minutes before going in, because he needed the transition. Claire was at the kitchen table when he came in. She looked at his face and read it correctly. "Done?" she said. "Done." She got up and made coffee without speaking, which was its own kind of statement. Marcus came downstairs in his Yankees cap, assessed the situation with the rapid accuracy of a 9-year-old who has been watching adults manage difficult things for several months and has developed a sophisticated read of kitchen atmospheres. "We keeping the house?" he said. "We're keeping the house," Ethan said. Marcus nodded in the way of someone receiving information they had already decided to believe. Then he went to the refrigerator and began a separate, apparently unrelated negotiation about the availability of leftover pasta, and life continued. Victor stayed through the winter. This was not originally the plan. The plan had been that he would stay until the hearing, and then through the Attorney General's preliminary response, and then through the holidays, because Claire had said, with the particular firm casualness she used for things she had decided but was framing as suggestions, that it made no sense for him to go back to the Bayview. By February, he had a rhythm that fit the house's rhythm, which was the kind of thing that happens when a person turns out to belong somewhere they didn't expect to belong. He and Marcus had developed an ongoing project involving a scale model of a Navy destroyer that Victor had found at the hardware store, and that Marcus had decided required significant creative modification, the results of which were periodically displayed on the kitchen table to Ethan and Claire's responses of diplomatic enthusiasm. Victor never talked about Vietnam. Marcus never asked. But sometimes in the evenings when Ethan was doing something in the kitchen and Marcus was at the table with the destroyer model and Victor was reading, the house had a quality of occupancy that felt like more than the sum of its people. Some layered, accumulated weight of continuity that Ethan had felt in the house before only faintly, in the particular way houses hold the presence of people who have lived and worked in them for a long time. He understood eventually that what he was feeling was his father's presence, connected now to Victor's, connected now to the thing Victor had carried here from a drainage ditch in the Quezon Valley in 1969 and set down finally in the right room. He didn't know what to do with that. He carried it the way you carry things that don't require action, not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be lived with, carefully, and in full. Emma Brooks stayed too, though differently. She stayed in Greyhaven Point, in a better apartment than the one that had been searched, and she stayed connected to the network of people the hearing had assembled, which had not dissolved after the vote, the way such assemblages sometimes do, but had instead converted itself into something more durable. She organized. She was good at it, in the specific way of people who have been quiet for a long time and have accumulated significant capacity during the quiet. By spring, she was running a community liaison program out of a room in the library, and Roy Pfeiffer was building her shelving for it, and Dorothea Crane was teaching a workshop on navigating county administrative processes, and Carl Buell from Morrison Street had become, improbably, the person everyone called when they weren't sure if their code violation notice was legitimate, because he had spent the winter educating himself with the focused intensity of a man who has decided that being afraid of something is insufficient reason to remain ignorant of it. Emma called Ethan one evening in March. "I want to do something with the space," she said. "Something more formal. Victor has resources. He mentioned a foundation he's been involved with, veterans outreach, community support. I've been thinking about a center." "Talk to Victor," Ethan said. "I have. He said to talk to you." A pause. "Why me?" "He said because it should be yours," she said. "His word. He was very specific about it." Ethan was on the back porch with Atlas, the March air still cold but with something different in it. The particular quality of cold that has started letting go rather than holding on. He looked at the dark yard and the harbor lights beyond the houses. "I'll think about it," he said. "Okay," Emma said. "He also said you'd say that." "What?" The Mercer Veterans Outreach Center opened on the first Saturday in September, which was warm in the specific way that early September on the Maine coast is warm. Not aggressive, not the demanding heat of July, but something generous and clear that makes the harbor look like a photograph of itself. It occupied the ground floor of a building on Clement Street that Victor had known was coming available and had quietly secured through a legal mechanism that Ethan hadn't fully followed but had trusted, because Victor's mechanisms had so far proven reliable. The sign above the door was simple. The interior was clean and functional. the kind of space that announces its purpose without performing it. Comfortable chairs, a resource table, a small library of materials Claire had helped organize, a community notice board that was already full by the opening day. Ethan stood inside the door during the dedication ceremony and watched the room fill with people. Pfeiffer was there with Margaret Holt, who had brought a casserole that sat on the resource table next to Emma's coffee setup, and Dorothea Crane's contribution of approximately 40 individually wrapped pieces of something that turned out to be a very good shortbread. Carl Buell was there, standing by the windows, not in his back row posture, but in a different one, still watchful, still contained, but present in a way that occupied rather than merely occupied space. Pete Slocum came, which surprised Ethan and shouldn't have. Danny Reyes drove up from Portland. Victor gave a short speech. He was not a dramatic speaker, as established. He was a precise one. He said the center existed because people in Greyhaven Point had stood up in a room together, and that standing up had made the room visible, and that the purpose of the center was to ensure that no one who needed to stand up had to find the room by themselves. He said it took him about 4 minutes. The room received it with the specific attentiveness of people who recognize when something is being said carefully and respond in kind. Then he looked at Ethan. "The man who directs this center," Victor said, "once told me in a hospital corridor that everything happening inside a building while he was in it was his business." A pause. "I want him to know that I consider that an accurate description of his qualifications." Someone laughed. The room laughed. Ethan looked at the floor briefly and then back up, because some things you don't look away from. After the speeches, after the casserole and the shortbread and the coffee and the conversations, Ethan was standing at the door watching people spill out onto Clement Street in the afternoon light when he saw Marcus. His nephew was down the sidewalk near the corner where an elderly man, a veteran Ethan didn't know, someone who had come in late and stood at the back and left early, was moving slowly toward the street with a cane, navigating the uneven pavement with the careful, small-step deliberation of someone for whom falling is not an abstract risk. Marcus had gotten there before anyone else noticed. He wasn't offering his arm in the theatrical way of a child who has been told to help elderly people. He was just walking beside the man, close enough to be available, saying something that made the man glance at him and then respond. And they moved together down the sidewalk and reached the corner, and the man stepped onto the street and turned back and said something to Marcus that Ethan couldn't hear at the distance. Marcus waved once. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walked back toward the center with the Yankees cap tilted against the afternoon light. He was 9 years old, and he walked like his grandfather. Ethan watched his nephew cross the sidewalk, and something in his chest that had been held at a particular tension for a very long time, months, maybe years, maybe longer than he'd been aware of, released itself without drama, the way tensions release when the thing that has been threatening finally passes and the body gradually, privately, accepts that it is allowed to stop bracing. Atlas was beside him. The dog's gray muzzle was in the afternoon light, and he was watching Marcus come back the way he watched most things worth watching, steadily, without urgency, with the complete and uncomplicated attention of a creature who has learned that what matters is rarely the loudest thing in the room. Victor appeared at Ethan's shoulder. He took the walker's weight and looked out at the street. "He has his grandfather's walk," Victor said, quietly. "I know," Ethan said. They stood there for a moment, the old man who had carried something across 50 years and set it down here, and the man who had been living inside that something his whole life without knowing its shape, and the dog who had decided on a rainy morning in a diner where he stood. The September afternoon held them all in its particular and different light, and the harbor went about its business, and Greyhaven Point continued in its way, imperfect, salt-worn, stubborn, and finally, in some rooms that hadn't existed 6 months ago, a little less alone. One act of courage does not need an audience to matter, but sometimes, in the right town, at the right moment, it finds one. And when it does not end with the person who made it. It moves forward, carried by people who weren't even in the room, toward mornings they cannot yet see.